Hey, in this video, I'm going to show you how I made this rustic, hand-hewn, reclaimed mantle. And if you have a fireplace at your house, how you can make one and install it for yourself. Looks pretty good, huh? I also wanted to tell you that the bourbon blades are back in stock on the website, which means if you go to the website right now and you order one, it'll ship in a couple days rather than having to do that whole pre-order thing and then wait months. Quantities are limited, so don't delay. If you haven't got one of these yet, it is my favorite EDC by far. Go check it out. Link in the description. But first, you should really watch and see how we did this, because it's pretty. Come sit by the fire. All right, that was a little creepy. Roll the thing. Let's get started.
So here's what the fireplace currently looks like. It already had this board bolted onto the brick and it was nice and sturdy. So I figured, why mess with it? So if you're wanting to do a mantle like this, you could just bolt a board to the bricks and then follow the next steps. My wife really wanted a mantle that was cabiny. So I went to a local salvage yard and I found some really cool old rustic looking beams, like this hand-hewn one right here, which I thought would be the perfect look and make a great mantle. So with Craig's help, we hauled it into the shop. After purchasing it, of course, we didn't walk out with it. That's shoplifting. And then it was time to figure out how in the world am I going to turn this into a mantle. You see, the bottom has this kind of curved profile. Well, that's what I'm going to make the bottom, because what is the top right now, flip it over so you can see it, in my opinion, is the coolest side. It's got a lot of character and notches and hewn marks, and I want that to face out, which means I have to get a flat edge on the back so it can sit flush against the brick. There's just one little problem. I measured the beam, and it's just under 10 inches. See, 10 inches. And then I went over and I measured my joiner, which was kind of pointless because I already know it's an 8-inch joiner, which means my joiner's not big enough. Now there are multiple different ways you could do this without a joiner. For example, you could make a router sled like you see me doing here in this video. Basically, it's two straight rails on either side of the piece that you need to flatten, and you just pass the router back and forth and you get a perfectly flat edge. That's option number one. Option number two, if you have a big enough planer, would be to make a planer sled. Basically, you take a flat piece of plywood, you shim your piece so that it's not wobbling all over the place, and then you run the piece and the plywood sled through the planer, getting a perfectly flat and smooth surface on one side. But both of those methods are pretty time-consuming. You know what would be really nice is if I just happened to have a 12-inch joiner just laying around my shop somewhere. You know, now that I think about it, I'm pretty sure I saw a giant 12-inch joiner laying around the shop when we demoed the old shop a few weeks ago. But it was still in a crate and had never been used, so step number one was to somehow get it away from the wall and out from the giant pile of tools. So we moved a bunch of stuff out of the way, brought in a pallet jack, jacked that thing up, and began trying to wiggle it out so that we could open this thing up and hopefully use it to flatten this beam. It didn't take too long when we had the thing out from away from the wall into open floor space, and I started beating the crap out of this crate with a sledgehammer and a crowbar. I mean, it's really nice that they package these super well, but it's kind of a pain to dismantle. And we still want to be able to move this around because we're not ready to completely set it up yet. So I decided just to leave it on the pallet for now. But once we got it unpackaged, I could see this thing will definitely do the trick. But like everything you buy, there is some assembly required. Thankfully, the nice folks over at Powermatic made the assembly process pretty quick and simple. We just had to bolt on the fence, hook up a long power cord, and we should be good to go. So I just had to find a 220 outlet. Looks like there's one right over here. I plug it in and hope for the best. Click. Oh, baby. Listen to that sweet mama jamma purr. This thing's actually kind of scary because not only is it 12 inches wide, the teeth on this thing are monstrous. No touchy. Next, we had to carry the beam back from my shop over to the old shop / gonna be new shop and try and run this thing through the joiner, which is still sitting on a pallet. So 1 pass, 2 passes, and 3 passes, and we were essentially done. I mean, that's all it took to get a nice flat surface on one side of this beam. Once we were done with that, we hauled it from the old shop that will eventually be the new shop back into the temporary shop where we could start figuring out the other components that needed to be done to make this beam into a mantel. Now, the last time I was over at the cabin, I took some measurements of that piece of wood that was bolted to the bricks, which are right here. My plan is to basically carve out that exact same shape on the back of the beam, and then I can just set the beam over that piece of wood, add a couple screws, and boom, installed. But first, I needed to cut the beam down a little bit because it was just a little bit too long. Now, the brick fireplace is 88 inches wide. I decided that I wanted to leave, about an inch of brick showing on either side, so I'm going to cut the entire thing down to 86 inches. So I draw a nice line with a Sharpie marker so that I can see, and then I pulled out this thingamabob. You might remember this tool from when we built the treehouse. It's basically a skill saw with a chainsaw attachment on it for doing just this, cutting into beams. So a little zip, a little zap, a little zoop, and pretty soon I managed to cut all the way through the beam, and now it was a nice, cool 86 inches. So far, so good. You should never play with chainsaws. Bad example, Jason. With the beam cut down to the proper size, now it was time to start figuring out how in the world I'm going to carve out a perfect rectangle on the back side. The first thing I did was chop down some pieces of poplar, because when you're thinking about carving out a big hole, poplar's your go-to wood. No, that's not true. Essentially, what I'm going to try and do is create a router template on the back side of this beam so that I can just use a router to get the exact shape that I need. This shape, to be exact. I mean, not that exact shape because I hand drew it, but those exact measurements. It's basically 70 some inches long, 5 and some inches tall, so I cut my poplar pieces down to those lengths. But they were a little bit too thick to be a router template because I wanted to be able to cut into the wood as deep as I could go. So I took those pieces, went over to the table saw, and I trimmed them down so they were just at 1/4 of an inch, which is plenty for the bearing on a router bit to land on and use as a reference. Next, I need to make sure that I get them aligned properly. So I cut another piece of scrap wood down that's exactly the same size as the piece of wood that's bolted to the bricks at the cabin. I made sure it was nice and centered from end to end, and then I tried to line it up with the top of the beam as best I could, but this is a rough sawn beam, so it's not perfect. So I just kind of eyeballed it. Next, I screwed that board into place so that it wouldn't move around. You're never going to see the back of this beam, so adding a bunch of screw holes really isn't that big of a deal. Once I had that internal board screwed in place, I took my other pieces that are going to be my router template. I drilled some holes through them so I didn't split the wood, and then I sunk in some screws. Now, if for some reason you didn't want to mess up the back of your beam, you could use double-sided tape or CA glue, but nobody's going to see it, so just use screws. It's way faster. I screwed in pieces on both sides, and then I removed that internal form that was getting me that shape. Then, once that internal form was removed, kind of like this, you could see the general shape that I need to cut out. But I still needed some end pieces, so I cut down some more scraps of poplar. I stuck one on each end. This is going to essentially make my finished router jig that's bolted right on there and isn't going to move. And just like that, I think we're ready to start routing. But of course, there's always another issue to figure out. Now, the router base has to sit on top of the template, but as you can see, it's going to wobble all over the place, and keeping it perfectly vertical is going to be quite the pain in the butt on these thin little strips. But, lucky for me, I've had this plexiglass router template base thing laying around my shop for years, and I've never really had a reason to use it. Now they call this a universal template, and it came with all these pre-drilled holes, but of course it fits every router on the planet except for the one that I'm actually wanting to use. So I marked out where I needed to add some additional holes, went over to the drill press, and I just countersunk some holes in the top. But because we need the screw to sit in there, then I had to drill another hole lower down so that the screw would fit. I mean, you get the gist of what's going on here. After I adapted the universal template to actually be universal, I screwed it onto the base of my router, kind of like this, and now the template can sit on both sides of the jig at the same time, and the router's not going to be flopping all over the place, which is going to make my life a lot easier because I'm obviously going to have to do multiple passes to get down to my final depth. Now I would love to use this giant bit from Bits and Bits because it would go really quick. The only problem is it's too long, so the bearing starts up too high, which means I'd have to plunge way into the wood to get the bearing to make contact with the jig. So I decided to use this tiny little guy for the first pass. After I do a pass on that one, I'll graduate to this one that's a little bit bigger, and then eventually work my way up to the biggest one. I know this is going to take a while, and I'm sure a lot of people out there are saying, man, you really need a CNC. I'm not disagreeing with you. A CNC would be perfect for this job. But do you see a CNC lying around my shop anywhere? Maybe I should go check that other crate in the old shop. No, I don't got time for that. We're just going to start cutting and hope for the best. After making sure my beam was securely fastened to my tabletop so that it wouldn't move around, I plunged the router in, cutting only 1/4 inch for my first pass because you don't want to take off too much material too fast. That's how you snap router bits and cause a bunch of damage. And then I started out by first going around the entire perimeter using my nice little router template to make sure that I got exactly the shape that I wanted. After my first pass, I realized, man, this is kind of making a lot of dust. And that's when I stopped and remembered, oh yeah, this router actually has a dust collection attachment. Maybe it would be a good idea to put that thing on there. Just pretend like you didn't see those first couple passes where I was blowing dust all over the place. Wow, look at that. Dust extraction actually works pretty decent. And then it was as simple as just going back and forth, just hogging out all that material. Did it take a long time? Absolutely, because that bit is tiny. But there was motivation to keep going, because if I did enough passes with the tiny bit, eventually I could work my way up to the big bit and do one more pass and be done. So anyways, with the smallest bit out of the way, I moved up one size so that I could go just a little bit deeper, chalked that thing up, and then I repeated the whole process. I did the entire perimeter, and then when that was done, I went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and I hogged out the entire middle section. You know, it really wasn't that bad. After a while, I started to get the hang of it, and I could do an entire pass in like 4.5 minutes, which, I got 4.5 minutes to spare. Eventually, I got down deep enough that I could switch to that big old monster bit. Once I put that thing in there, it was all systems go because this thing removed material like none other. I'll put a link to this specific Bits and Bits bit in the video description. You're gonna want to get one of those. Some people really have a problem with repetitive work, and most of the time I am one of those people because I'm so ADD. But I gotta tell you, I kind of got in this weird zen-like zone. I was just routering, and before I knew it, I was pretty close to being done. Eventually, I went as deep as I could with the router, but I still needed about another 1/4 inch. Lucky for me, all I had to do was remove my router template strips on either side because the hole was deep enough at this point that I could just use the sides of the hole as my new router template. With those gone, I would be able to plunge another 1/4 inch and get to my final depth, which was about 1 5/8 inches deep. So a little zip, a little zap, a little zoop later, easy peasy lemon squeezy, all that garbage, and I had the entire thing hogged out. Well, not completely. I mean, I almost have the entire thing hogged out. Yes, there's more back and forth, but you don't have to watch that whole thing. Just believe me, I got the entire thing all hogged out. Also, can I just stop and say, is hogged out the correct term? Routed out? Dug out? Whatever you want to call it. Then I pulled out my sander, and I didn't want to sand this too much because I really like the whole rough look of the beam, but I did want to remove as many splinters as I could. There was also these fresh cut marks on both ends of the beam, so I grabbed some Rubio Monocoat pre-aging. This stuff is a game changer when you're working with reclaimed wood because it's always hard to hide those fresh cut marks. So I just splotched a little of this on there. Splotched again, probably not the correct word, and eventually it'll look exactly like the rest of the beam. Then back to the sander to remove some more splinters, and now I gotta figure out how I'm going to attach this to that wood block. My idea is just to send some screws in through the top, but I didn't want the screws to be visible. So luckily I had this little offcut piece from when I cut the beam down to length. I went over to my bandsaw, I cut off a few little scrap blocks, then I went over to the drill press. Hey, look at that, nice drill storage cabinet. I wish there was a video on that thing. Anyways, I grabbed a plug cutter. These are available on my website. I'll include a link in the video description. I made some nice little plugs out of my scrap piece of beam wood, popped them out of there, just kind of like this. And now when I add those screws to the top, I can plug the holes and hopefully nobody will even know that they're there. And with that, I'm pretty sure this mantle is ready to install. Craig was nowhere to be found, so I carried the entire giant thing out to my truck all by myself. Nearly threw out my back while doing it. Come on, Craig. And then we drove over the mountain and to the cabin. Again, this is what it looks like right now. It's got this piece of wood with these bolts sticking out. We're gonna have to do something about those bolts. But I gave it the good old test, meaning I hung from it, and it didn't budge. So I'm pretty sure it's strong enough to hold this beam. So we carried the mantle inside through the front door, past that fake set of stairs that I only put up to fool the inspector, and over to the hearth. I can already tell this thing is going to look so sweet up there. It matches the color of the floor almost perfect. And it's got that really old cabiny vibe, which I'm going for. There's just the one issue we still have to figure out. It's nice and smooth on the inside, and this board has these bolts sticking out. So we just grabbed the entire mantle, stuck it up there, and then all you have to do is grab a hammer and a scrap piece of wood and beat on it. Those bolts will just bury themselves in the beam and you don't have to worry about them. I'm completely kidding. That is not what I'm doing here. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm just beating on it with a hammer so that those bolts leave indentations on the inside. Now I know exactly where I have to remove some more material so that the beam will sit flush against the bricks. Because the bolts are somewhat round, I figured the easiest way to do this would just be with a Forstner bit. So I drilled 4 holes and we should be good to go. Except for one other small issue. When we put the beam up just to test the fit, I didn't think it looked level enough. I mean, I made it as level as I could with that recess in the back, but because it's a reclaimed beam, I thought it needed to be a little higher on the left side than the right side. But there was no wiggle room in my carved out section on the back of the beam. So I pulled that board off of the bricks, went out to the garage where I just happened to have a portable table saw laying around, and I trimmed a little material off the bottom. This will give us some space to shim up the left side of the beam and hopefully make it look a little more level. So with that material trimmed off the bottom, we bolted that wood back onto the brick fireplace, and then I just took one of the offcuts from the bottom like this, set it on the top of that left corner, and hopefully that'll work as a shim to make it look all nice and level. So we pushed that thing back up there, and I mean, again, it's not perfect. It's a reclaimed beam. It's never gonna be perfect, but it was more perfect than it was the first time, and well, that's perfect enough for me. Now to permanently affix it to the bricks. I drilled some holes with a 3/8 inch bit. I sent in some 3.5 inch GRK screws, and that's pretty much it. I mean, I only put 4 screws in the top of this, but I think it's pretty rock solid. I mean, it can't really come off of the wall. The wood that it's screwed into is really solid, so if it does fall off, I'll let you know eventually. Once I had all those screws in place, I gave it the old heave-ho. And by heave-ho, I mean I grabbed it and pulled really, really hard. And again, it didn't budge, it didn't wiggle, it didn't wobble. I think we're good. Now to hide the evidence that we used any screws at all. The plugs were a little too long, so I just used a chisel to cut them down to the right length, inserted them in the holes, and tapped them in with a hammer. I didn't even use any glue. I like the idea that eventually, if I ever want to take the mantle down, I could potentially pull these plugs back out, remove the screws, and then the whole thing would just come off the wall. I don't see that ever happening. I mean, once it's up there, why would we take it down? But might as well give myself the option. With the mantle installed, it was time to add a few necessary accoutrements, like this sweet albino deer that my wife randomly bought at an antique store. Once that was hung up, there was just one thing left to do, and that was to build a nice warm fire and enjoy that mantle. So I did, even though, to be completely honest, it was like 70 degrees inside already. I was kind of hot in that flannel, and I did not want to sit by a fire. But it looks good on camera.
Well, there you have it, a one-day reclaimed mantle. So hopefully now you can go do the same thing to your house. Unless you don't have a chimney, which in that case, it's pretty sad because that means Santa can't get to your house because you don't have a fireplace. But we'll deal with that later. Don't forget, the Bourbon blade is back in stock on the website. Link is in the video description. We're gonna sell out of these really quick, all right? This is batch 3. They've been flying off the shelves, so go get yours right now before they're gone. Or you'll have to be back on the pre-order list and you're gonna be waiting for months, and nobody wants that. I mean, you want this thing right now. Instant gratification. Wow, that is a nice square space. Actually, it's a rectangle, but this video is sponsored by Squarespace, so you see where I'm going. Now, if you don't know what Squarespace is, well, you haven't been watching our videos because we've been sponsored by them for a long time, and I'm thrilled by it because I love Squarespace. The very first website I ever made, I made using Squarespace. I knew nothing about web design, but that doesn't matter with Squarespace because you just get on their website, you pick out a template, you plug in all your pictures and information, and boom, you got a website. And if you can't find a template that's perfect for you, it's okay because all their templates are customizable. If you run an e-commerce business, Squarespace is great because you can upload unlimited amounts of products directly to their website, and it is so quick and easy to sell directly online. And if you're selling online and in person, Squarespace is great for that too, because you can sell everything directly through the Squarespace app. You can take credit cards and it automatically updates the quantities on your website, so you don't have to keep track of quantities in 2 places. Squarespace is also doing some really sweet new stuff with AI. If you don't believe me, just check this out. They've just introduced their design intelligence. What's design intelligence, you might ask? Well, they take 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise, they mix it with a little cutting-edge AI technology, and they unlock your strongest creative potential. Design intelligence basically empowers anyone to build a beautiful website, more personalized websites tailored to their unique needs, and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. Custom domains, newsletters. I mean, the stuff you can do with Squarespace is endless, and it's all quick and easy, and you don't have to be a web designer. That's the best part. So if you want to check out Squarespace, you should go to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking. You get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Or you can just use the coupon code BOURBONMOTHWOODWORKING at checkout. We'll put a link somewhere around here and down in the video description. Trust me, if you're looking for an easy way to make a professional looking website, look no farther, Squarespace.